Hello, my name is Frank Gaffney, and I'm very pleased to be able to present to you a big picture, a view of Asia, North Asia specifically, and the implications not only for the region but for the world, including the United States, of the very, very troubling rise of the Chinese Communist Party, its ambitions, and what they will mean for our interests and allies and the people of North Asia, among others. To talk about all of that, we have with us a man of extraordinary skill and thoughtfulness and experience. A United States Marine colonel, now retired, a man who served in the Foreign Service of the United States. He was also a very successful businessman in Asia, and he is these days a senior fellow of my own Center for Security Policy. His name is Colonel Grant Newsham, United States Marine Corps retired, a good friend, a valued colleague, and an extraordinarily important resource on the topics we'll be discussing today. Colonel Newsham, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to the Big Picture.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We're going to start with China, Grant, because it is, of course, the Borg, as some would put it, that is now increasingly endangering so much of the world. We'll focus probably mostly on the area that you've spent much of your professional life in uniform and out, Asia, but we might touch on some of the other parts of the world that are feeling the hot breath of the Chinese Communist Party too. But let's start with how you would characterize the nature of the regime in China and the ambitions specifically of the dictator of the place, Xi Jinping.
Well, there's nothing friendly or nice about the Chinese regime. It's the sort of regime that has existed for thousands of years. It's an aggressive, brutal, nasty dictatorship. And there's no other way to characterize it, even though for many years the American commentariat, the elites, the business class, the financial class all expected that if they accommodated China, it would gradually liberalize, turn into a friendlier place, sort of like a really big Canada. And it was obvious at least 25 years ago that was not going to happen. But it's really until about the last year, or during parts of the Trump administration, that people sort of realized that this hypothesis was mistaken, and that is much too late. But China's objective, and this is the thing to always keep in mind, it's to drive the United States out of Asia and to have China dominate the region. And China is not just content with getting the Americans out of Asia. They want the whole thing. They want the whole world, and it's domination that they're after.
Yeah. How is it that we came to be so deluded about the prospects of deviating a regime that, as you say, has had a pedigree of repression going back to successive dynasties, not communists, but dynasties nonetheless? Was it individuals here in the United States that were responsible? Was it greed? Was it, sort of groupthink? The sort of official party line, not just of China, but of the United States? How would you characterize how we gotten ourselves into this fix?
Well, it wasn't leprechauns that did it. And it is ultimately people who, are to blame for this. And, you can take your pick of where you want to start, but Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger going to China, and they say opening it up. But basically they said, welcome aboard, and you don't have to change. You don't have to do anything.
Right.
We want to be friends with you, and we're going to kick Taiwan to the curb. So that is not a bad starting place. But then there's been plenty of aiders and abettors, and you look at the business class, for example, American industry that has all been deluded to think that they had to be in China. They just had to be, like lemmings. And in the process, what has happened is that the American manufacturing sector, these communities in what is now the so-called Rust Belt, were gutted just as effectively as if you dropped a bomb on them.
Yes.
And so the business class had a hand in it. And then you have Wall Street, the financial class, which similarly has been sort of blinded by this illusion of untold wealth in China. But the financial class, you have to realize, they don't actually invest their own money in China. They invest other people's money, and they get a cut of the money going into China and the money coming out of China. So they're actually less concerned about the success of any given investment. And then you have academia.
And they have actually benefited massively financially from these transactions, as you say, by not so much their clients, it seems, but the investors and their commissions and so on have done handsomely. But you're going to enumerate another class that's responsible.
To lay into academia, and the so-called the foreign policy elites. The smart money was that, well, if you treat China like an enemy, you'll make them an enemy. So therefore, appease them, accommodate them, understand them, give them time. And that was the thinking, the mindset. And people who said otherwise, throughout this period, both civilians and even in the military, they were ostracized, humiliated, often denied professional advancement and opportunities. And it was a very small number of people who actually did say what was coming, and they were all right. And you also found the U.S. military. For all these years, they refused to think that China could be an adversary. Partly it was a thought that, well, the Chinese just don't want to take us on because we're so splendid, we're the Americans. The other was, well, if we extend the open hand of friendship to the Chinese, that they will respond accordingly. We just have to address their fears. And this was at the very top levels, and that, too, has put us sort of behind the curve, to put it mildly.
Right. I think there was another sort of strain to this, and I think you've dissected it brilliantly, but this idea that if we simply went along because we believed they would be so deeply engaged with us, they couldn't possibly seek to do us harm, was another calculation, the pragmatists, maybe you would call them, that will just be so entangled and intertwined. How do you respond to that? I mean, what is the doctrine of the Chinese Communist Party? Does it seem to be writing off the possibility that they could use even military force, let alone other techniques? We'll talk a bit about unrestricted warfare in a moment, as long as they were deeply engaged with us?
No, they actually have been engaging to their own advantage. And the idea is to put your adversary on the back foot, at the disadvantage. And ultimately, you can turn the tables. But you want it to happen so slowly and gradually that they don't really see what's coming. And they can, when you think there's money involved, Westerners in particular can always convince themselves that what they're seeing isn't really what it looks like. And it's been very clear, as I said, from the beginning what the Chinese objectives were. This is a communist regime. And one thing you do say to people who've sort of have argued the other position, that we just have to give them another chance, keep accommodating, don't frighten them, is, well, what empirical evidence do you have that your hypothesis is working?
Right.
What is it? And there is none. And that is... So you hardly know what to say, but that allure of money and a failure to admit one was wrong, probably two of the big sort of issues
forces
here.
At work. Yeah. Let me ask you about another piece of this, what the Chinese did to promote this woolly-headed thinking, one might call it. Deng Xiaoping, who came on the scene and essentially was breaking with Mao by opening to the West, as they say, had a strategy that came to be called hide and bide. To what extent did that play into all of this? Were they really disguising their true intentions, or were they just enabling us to engage in the cognitive dissonance you've just described?
I think it was more of the latter. I think that you notice throughout this period that the evidence has always been there, and there's been people who knew it and could see it. But on the Western side, on our side, there was just a refusal to admit that these people could have malevolent intentions for us. And keep in mind, Deng Xiaoping, who's considered the reformer, the open-up one, he was as nasty a creature as you will find. But compared to Mao,
you don't get to the top of that particular pyramid without being ruthless.
No, and you look at his experience, say, when he ran Tibet. Holy cow! These are nasty people, and so
Tiananmen. on his watch, right?
It sure was.
Yeah.
And, that's...
and interestingly enough, I mean, the reason I think it's important to think about Tiananmen, because in a way it was the apotheosis of the kind of, mindless pursuit of China that you've just, as I say, described so well, Grant Newsham. When you had Brent Scowcroft, the national security advisor to President George H.W. Bush, racing over to Beijing in the immediate aftermath of that monstrous massacre to say it's not going to interfere with business as usual, whether they were hiding or they weren't hiding, they were certainly, I'm sure, taking this as further proof that they would have their way with us, no?
Oh, you'd have to. You'd think you can get away with anything in that case. And actually that letter that Brent Scowcroft delivered to the Chinese dictator, it was handwritten by President George H.W. Bush. And it's on the internet. And it's worth looking up to read it because it is as obsequious and just a spineless sort of an apology that you could imagine. He's almost saying, well, tut, tut, tut. Let's be friends.
Yeah.
And I'm so disappointed in you, but let's be friends. And what happened after that is the U.S. government encouraged U.S. business to get into China big time, and they did. And the company I used to work for, Motorola, actually was the anchor tenant of that move.
It was.
And basically, they went into China. They did everything right. Everything the authorities wanted. They built factories. They hired lots of Chinese to good jobs.
I'm told they actually replicated down to the bricks some of their facilities in the United States there.
Well,
and then what happened that, as you say, led to the Rust Belt?
Well, they committed suicide.
Yeah.
And Motorola today, what is left of it is Chinese-owned, most of it. And to say they did everything you were supposed to do, but what they did is they built up their competition. And the technology that they didn't hand over was stolen, of course. But the Chinese are smart. And a lot of what we see here is a condescension towards the Chinese people, that, they could never be our equals. And you've seen that in the military. You've seen it in business. There was even the head of one of the Hughes groups back in the early 90s said that, he didn't care if they gave China their technology because Hughes will always be ahead of them. Right. And you underestimate the Chinese at your own peril.
Well, especially when you go back to your point about academia. We've been training a generation or two of the Chinese best people in our best institutions. At some point, that matters. In addition, of course, to simply stealing things and getting people to sell you sort of perhaps on the QT what they shouldn't. Grant, this is a picture of a very frightening entity led by determined, ruthless people who have the ambition of, as you say, world domination. And that means not just sort of running things, but actually crushing anybody who's in the way, including, most especially, I would argue, us. Which brings me to, what does that mean for nations more proximate to China than we are, with whom we have important alliance relationships? I mean, we could start with Japan, a country that you know well, you've lived in for a long time, you're based there now. How do the Japanese see the Chinese? There's a lot of bad history between them, of course, but what's the current view of the China threat in Tokyo?
Well, the Japanese government, say the majority of it, and particularly the ruling administration, they've finally woken up to the China threat, and there is real concern of China. And particularly the Chinese, as everyone knows, they're trying to take over some of Japan's southern islands, and the Chinese fishing boats, Coast Guard, Navy, and Air Force are sort of always encroaching. It just gets worse and worse and worse every month practically. So the Japanese government is by and large worried. The Japanese military has known this for a long time, and the expression that you would hear from Japanese officers was, Taiwan's defense is Japan's defense. And they're very well aware of the Chinese threat. But what you found is that even though there's an awareness of this, that you don't see the concrete steps being taken to protect Japan, to be able to defend it from a sort of a Chinese onslaught someday, or to support the Americans the way they should. And it's worth pointing out that the Japanese, like us, they have a business class which is very interested in doing business with China, and that has put a sort of a damper on things. But very interesting is the Japanese population, when they do these surveys, they come out at about 90% having negative feelings about China.
Wow.
It's about 90%. But if you go into Japan's political class, it's much lower than that, because it's not just the military threat from Japan, but it's the subversion. It's the political warfare that has been very effective in Japan, as it has in Washington, D.C., in sort of buying off a constituency for China.
The application of what the Chinese have called unrestricted warfare against Japan, something they've been practicing against us as well. And if it is, talk a little bit about what that looks like in practice and why it's so lethal to democracies like ours.
Yeah, well, it's really an assault on the mind, on the way people think, rather than sort of a physical assault to take over territory or to kill people. But it's to change the way people think. And it's often very sort of sinister or very hard to see, because it can be that's the right word I was looking for, but because you can have it, say you bring the chairman of an opposition political party from Japan and 100 of his fellow Diet members or congressmen, they come to China for a study tour, and they have a good time, lots of hospitality, and then of course there's
the fringe benefits.
Well, girls and money and blackmail that comes with it.
Whatever. Yeah.
But you invite them over, and they've gone on the study tour, and it's changed their way of thinking about China. Oh, they're not a threat. I've met them. They gave us a great dinner. We toasted each other. And that's so. And
or they've been compromised.
Well, that's part of it as
too,
well. And
right.
in fact, in Japan's ruling party, there are people, prominent politicians, who are sort of widely suspected of having been compromised. I mean, very prominent politicians. And once again, Japan is not unique. But also you have the business class. If you can create people who see their financial well-being as dependent on China, they're willing to overlook anything.
Yes.
And you see that working on it. So you've got the political parts of the political class. You've had the business class. And even if they are just sort of show a smiling face, even the public will sort of think, well, they're not so bad. And then you get academia, invite them over for seminars and conferences, first-class airfare, 5-star hotels, and you get those people.
And not least the visas that enable you to be a specialist in China.
Very much.
Without which you really can't be. The media as well is a target for the Chinese Communist Party, is it not? And in terms of shaping public opinion and influencing everybody in the society. How does that operate in Japan?
Well, it's called media warfare, or public opinion warfare, but it is very much part of the Chinese menu of things they do to dominate. And there are, in Japan, you have some newspapers that are more leftist than others. In fact, one in particular is very prominent, very widely read. It's sort of their New York Times, and it has always had an anti-American, anti-military, pro-China slant to it. And
kind of like our New York Times, now that I think about it.
No, kind of. Yeah. And so what you do is you have, say, officials from the embassies who just go out to meet the reporters, meet the editors in particular, and you gradually sort of win them over. And
there's some of that wining and dining and taking them to China and all that too. It's a big part of
what it is. And,
the influence operation. So Grant, Japan sounds as though it's on the horns of the proverbial dilemma, that there's some recognition of a mortal peril and there's some deep compromise. Is that true of another of our key allies in the region, which you're also very familiar with, South Korea?
No, definitely. In South Korea, you have a big slice of the political class, and particularly the current administration, and which is a leftist administration. And there are a lot of leftists in South Korea. And these people do have a sort of a bent, a mindset that China is, in fact, where South Korea ought to be aligned. And they won't say it loudly, but they do say it. It's there to be heard if you want to, that they see America as the problem, the thing that keeps the peninsula divided, that keeps Koreans from being united. And they see the Americans as an occupying force of all things. And, it's there to be seen. You just have to read what these people say and what they've listened, and listen to them. And I point as one example the current president, Moon Jae-in. He's wrote in his book that he said, well, when I heard the Americans were defeated in Vietnam, I was euphoric. So there's no telling what he feels after this Afghanistan fiasco.
Indeed.
But so you do have in South Korea a sort of a pro-China leaning. But once again, when you get into the public at large, it's different. But if you have a hardcore coterie of ideologues, that they can move a country often where it doesn't want to go. So that's one example.
And I think it's fair to say that it has to be a consideration as well that there are, I'm told, 1 million Chinese nationals in South Korea these days. There's the other piece of this, which I also wanted just to draw you out on, because China has, of course, a proxy in its efforts to shape or otherwise influence, dominate, certainly control Japan and South Korea, and that would be North Korea. Talk a little bit about the relationship between these countries, China on the one hand and North Korea on the other. It's been said, and I happen to believe, that there would be no North Korea if there were not this relationship, this patronage, this protection by China. Is that your view as well?
Oh, yes. And I think it's probably even North Korea's view. It's pretty obvious as well. Without the oil, without the economic support, the financial support, North Korea could not exist. And China could turn it off in an afternoon. And its successive U.S. administrations have not taken on that challenge. They've just beaten their heads against walls trying to figure out some way to accommodate North Korea, to get them to be nice, to give up their weapons and just back off and become once again, like Canadians. But they've been unsuccessful. And as long as you focus only on North Korea and don't focus on China, you won't succeed. And what do? Go after the big Chinese banks. Yeah. And they haven't done it. Even the Trump administration didn't do it.
There was a time, was it the George W. Bush administration that developed the technique with considerable effect? There was a proof of principle, but as you say, it's not been repeated as best I can tell. Yeah. And when you look at this, Grant, does your informed opinion lead you to say that if China wanted the North Koreans to act aggressively against the South or otherwise operate in a disruptive fashion towards the United States and its forces in Japan and so on, that this regime in Pyongyang would do it?
I think they probably would. Keep in mind, of course, that these are Koreans, and they're not Chinese lapdogs by any means. That the relationship between Chinese and Koreans, it's not all that great. There's a friction in it, even for North Korea and China. So we should always keep that in mind. But the dependency is such that North Korea really has no choice. And also, they also don't mind doing it.
That's right.
So what you would see, I think, one possibility is if China makes a move somewhere else, say against Japan or against Taiwan, that they wouldn't complain if North Korea were to, say, launch a missile into South Korea or into Japan. Just to keep the Americans distracted, to keep everyone from focusing only on what the Chinese are doing elsewhere. So that's a possibility.
Grant, the reason I ask is the possibility of China actually acting against somebody else, Taiwan. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next segment of our conversation with you. If the Chinese want a distraction or something that at least preoccupies the United States and perhaps the Japanese or South Koreans or all of the above, when they go for it in Taiwan, this could well be one of the things that they pull out of their bag of tricks. We're going to take a short break. We're going to be back in a moment with more with Grant Newsham, United States Marine Corps retired colonel and one of our great strategists and analysts and practitioners of security policy in Asia. He is going to talk with us about Taiwan, the threats to it, and what we must do to try to mitigate those threats at the minimum, if not prevent them altogether. Stay tuned for more of The Big Picture right after this.